Welcome. Settle in wherever you are, let your muscles soften against whatever is holding you, and allow the sounds of the day to begin their slow retreat. We are going to go somewhere tonight, not far and not fast. We're going to move gently backward through time, following the thread of a question that is in its own quiet way one of the most surprising things that modern science has uncovered about the human past. There is no rush. The story will unfold at its own pace, and by the time it reaches its end, you may already be somewhere else entirely. Somewhere soft and dark and restful, where stories are no longer needed. There was a quiet assumption buried deep in the way we think about the past. It is so familiar, so woven into the fabric of how we understand human progress, that most people have never thought to question it. The assumption is this, that life for human beings has always been getting better, that each age that followed the last was an improvement, that the farmer was better off than the wanderer, that the villager was healthier than the nomad, that civilization by its very nature made human bodies stronger and human lives longer. It is a comforting thought, and it is, in many important ways, incorrect. Tonight, as you settle into the quiet of wherever you are, as the sounds of the day grow distant and the world outside becomes still, we are going to travel back through time together. Not to a dramatic battlefield or a moment of political upheaval, but to something far quieter and more surprising. The bodies of people who lived thousands of years ago, the bones they left behind, the teeth preserved in the earth. The remarkable story those remains have slowly told of the scientists patient enough to listen. What those bones reveal is one of the great quiet paradoxes of human history. The men and women who lived on this earth before the invention of agriculture, before the plough, before the wheat field, before the bread oven and the grain store, were, in many measurable ways, physically superior to the people who came after them. They were taller, their teeth were straighter and more complete, their bones were denser, their skeletons showed fewer signs of chronic disease, fewer signs of prolonged malnutrition, fewer of the curved spines and shortened limbs that would come to mark the bodies of the farming poor who followed them. And then, thousands of years later, in the great halls and muddy lanes of the medieval world, something remarkable was still visible in the bones of the people buried in churchyards across Europe and Asia and beyond. The peasants who tilled the fields, who bent their backs over the same soil season after season, who ate the bread that is supposed to represent civilization's great gift to humanity. Those people were shorter, sicker, and in many cases more poorly nourished than the hunters and gatherers who had walked the earth 10 or 20,000 years before them. How is this possible? How did progress, in some fundamental biological sense, move backward? How did the invention of farming, one of the most celebrated turning points in all of human history, result, at least for a time, in bodies that were measurably worse off than those of the people it replaced? And what does this mean for us, living now so many centuries further along? What does it tell us about the relationship between civilization and the human body, between complexity and well-being, between what we build and what we become? These are the questions we will sit with tonight, slowly, without hurry. There is no urgency here. There is only the curiosity and the quiet pleasure of thinking carefully about things most people never stop to consider. There is a particular kind of satisfaction in this sort of question, the kind that seems simple on the surface but opens, when you press gently against it, into something much larger and more complex. A question about the height of ancient skeletons turns out to be a question about diet, and about labour, and about the structure of communities, and about the relationship between collective prosperity and individual well-being. It reaches forward into the present, touching things we experience in our own bodies every day without necessarily recognizing their deep history. And it reaches backward into a past so remote that most of us never think of it at all. A past that is nonetheless, in a very precise biological sense, alive and present in everything we are. So let us begin at the beginning, not with medieval peasants, and not even with the first farmers. Let us begin much further back, in a world that most of us can barely imagine, walking slowly through its landscapes and its possibilities, taking our time, letting the details accumulate gently the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a quiet lake. The question at the heart of tonight's story is deceptively simple. If farming gave humans more food security, more stable settlements, more organized societies, why did it make so many individual bodies worse? This is not a fringe observation. It is not the speculation of a single contrarian researcher working against the grain of established thought. It is, in fact, one of the most well-documented and carefully studied findings in all of physical anthropology. Archaeologists and biological anthropologists have been accumulating evidence for this conclusion for decades, pulling it from thousands of skeletal remains across dozens of sites on multiple continents. The data, when you look at it quietly and steadily, is genuinely astonishing. To understand it, we need to think about what food actually does to the human body, not in the abstract language of nutrition labels and health advice, but in the deep, slow language of evolution. We need to think about what our bodies were shaped to expect, what they were designed, over hundreds of thousands of years of very gradual change, to receive and process and thrive on. And we need to think about what happens when the food a body receives diverges sharply from the food that body was built to handle. But we also need to think about something even more fundamental: the nature of work, the nature of movement, the question of what kind of physical life keeps the human skeleton strong and the human immune system resilient. Because the story of why Stone Age people are taller and healthier than medieval peasants is not a story about food. It is a story about the whole shape of a human life, how bodies were used, how they rested, what they were exposed to and protected from, what communities looked like, and what kind of social support they provided. And at the centre of all of this is a quiet, almost philosophical observation that the human body is very old. It carries within it the inheritance of millions of years of evolution on specific landscapes, eating specific foods, moving in specific ways. And when the world changes faster than evolution can follow, which is exactly what happened when agriculture transformed human life in just a few thousand years, the body is left behind. It continues to operate according to instructions written in a world that no longer exists. This idea, the mismatch between an ancient body and a rapidly changing environment, is one of the central concepts of evolutionary medicine, a field that has grown substantially over the past few decades and has begun to offer genuinely novel ways of understanding human health and disease. The core insight is straightforward. Natural selection is slow. Thousands of generations are required for a significant genetic change to spread through the population. The transition from hunting and gathering to farming took only a few hundred generations. The Industrial Revolution took only a few. The digital revolution has happened within a single lifetime. The world transforms itself again and again at a pace that biology simply cannot match. And so we find ourselves always, to some degree, living in the wrong world, carrying a body built for one set of conditions and asking it to perform in another. This is not a simple story of good versus bad, of one era being entirely superior to another. Every period of human history had its particular sufferings and its particular gifts. Hunter-gatherers faced dangers and uncertainties that medieval peasants, for all their hardships, did not. Infectious disease, predation, the sudden failure of a hunting season, the vulnerability of a small group in a large and indifferent landscape, these were real and serious challenges that the agricultural revolution over time helped to mitigate, at least partially. And medieval peasants lived within social and spiritual frameworks of extraordinary richness and complexity, within traditions of faith and community and seasonal celebration that provided forms of meaning and belonging that were, in their own way, profound. But tonight we are thinking specifically about the body, about height and bone density and the state of teeth, about what the skeleton can tell us with remarkable precision about the quality of a life, and what the skeleton tells us again and again across the archaeological record is a story that inverts much of what we were taught to assume about the relationship between civilization and physical well-being. There is a particular researcher whose words have stayed with me as I've thought about this subject. The bioarchaeologist Clark Spencer Larson, who has spent his career studying the skeletal record of populations across the transition from foraging to farming, has described the pattern he observed in his research as one of the most consistent findings in the entire study of ancient human remains. Across cultures, across continents, across different crops and different climates, the pattern repeats. Farming populations show elevated markers of nutritional stress, more infectious disease, more evidence of childhood growth disruption, and shorter average stature than the foragers who preceded them. The universality of this pattern is what makes it so striking. It is not an accident of one region, or one crop, or one set of historical circumstances. It is something about the transition itself, something fundamental to the shift from a diverse, mobile, opportunistic food strategy to a sedentary, simplified, grain-centered one. Let us follow that story now from its very earliest origins, moving slowly and without rush through a deep time, letting the details come to us gently. To understand the health of stone-aged humans, we must first understand the world they inhabited, not as a series of dramatic events, but as an environment, a texture of daily reality that shaped bodies over incomprehensibly long stretches of time. The story of our genus, Homo, begins in Africa somewhere around 2.5 million years ago. But the story of our own species, Homo sapiens, the anatomically modern humans, whose skeletons we would recognize as essentially identical to our own, begins much more recently. The oldest fossils of Homo sapiens that have been identified were found in Morocco at a site called Jebel Irhoud, and they date to approximately 300,000 years ago. For most of the time since then, our species lived entirely as hunters and gatherers, moving across landscapes following animal migrations, exploiting seasonal plant resources, drinking from rivers and springs, sheltering in caves and beneath rock overhangs and in simple constructed camps. This period, the vast, almost incomprehensible span of time before the invention of agriculture, is what archaeologists call the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age. It ended, depending on the region of the world, somewhere between 10,000 and 5,000 years ago. And within it, the human body was shaped by consistent and repeated exposure to a particular kind of life. The first thing to understand about that life is its physical demands. Paleolithic humans walked. They walked enormously by modern standards. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups, the few that still exist, living in environments similar in some ways to those of the ancient past, suggest that adults routinely covered between 7 and 15 miles per day on foot, not as exercise, not as a deliberate practice for health, simply as the natural consequence of finding food, moving between camps, gathering water, exploring territory. To appreciate just how different this is from modern life, it is worth holding in mind what it means to walk 7 miles. For most modern adults, walking 7 miles in a day is an accomplishment worth noting, a deliberate effort, something you might do on a hiking day or a particularly active holiday. For a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer, it was Tuesday. It was just what the day was made of. And this was not merely a feature of certain individual days, it was the texture of every day, the baseline condition of human physical life for the entire Paleolithic period and long before it. The human body did not evolve to sit, it evolved to move. And it did move, constantly, moderately, through varied terrain, for hundreds of thousands of years before the first human ever sat in a chair. This constant moderate movement had profound effects on the human skeleton. Bones, like muscles, respond to use. They grow denser and stronger in response to repeated mechanical loading. The femurs, the large bones of this upper leg, of Paleolithic humans from sites across Europe and Africa show a degree of structural reinforcement that is rarely seen in modern human remains. Researchers studying these bones have found that Paleolithic hunters had leg bone cross-sections indicating physical activity levels comparable to long-distance runners today, but sustained over a lifetime rather than as a training regimen. And this matters enormously for what comes later. A body that has been in constant moderate motion since childhood, that's been building bone density and muscle mass and cardiovascular efficiency through years and decades of sustained use, is a fundamentally different organism than a body that has been largely sedentary or confined to repetitive, narrow physical tasks. The skeleton of a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer tells the story of a whole body engaged constantly with its environment. The skeleton of a medieval peasant tells a different story, as we will see. The second thing to understand about Paleolithic environments is their dietary complexity. This is perhaps the single most important factor in understanding the health advantage that Stone Age people appeared to enjoy, and it requires some careful thought. When we imagine what early humans ate, we often default to oversimplified images. The dramatic hunt, the mammoth, brought down by a group of spear-wielding figures against a dramatic landscape. But the reality of the Paleolithic diet was far more varied, far more nuanced, and in many ways far more sophisticated than this image suggests. Yes, meat was important. The hunting of large and medium-sized animals provided essential protein and fat, and it provided nutrients, particularly fat-soluble vitamins and certain amino acids, that are difficult to obtain in sufficient quantities from plant sources alone. But the plant side of the Paleolithic diet was equally extraordinary. Studies of living hunter-gatherer groups combined with analysis of dental calculus, the mineralized plaque preserved on ancient teeth, and gut contents in well-preserved remains, have given us an increasingly detailed picture of the botanical diversity that characterized early human diets. Hunter-gatherers routinely consumed between 100 and 200 distinct plant species over the course of a year, depending on region and season. Roots and tubers, wild fruits and berries, leaves and shoots, seeds and nuts and mushrooms, each of these plants brought its own unique complement of vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients and fibre. This diversity is not a minor detail. It is, from a nutritional standpoint, perhaps the most important characteristic of the Paleolithic diet. The human body requires an extraordinary range of micronutrients to function well, vitamins and minerals whose names most people know only vaguely, if at all, but which are essential to every process from bone formation to immune function to neurological health. And the most reliable way to obtain all of these micronutrients in sufficient quantities is to eat a genuinely diverse diet drawn from many different sources. A diet that rotates through seasonal availability, that changes with the landscape, that incorporates foods from across the full spectrum of what the natural world provides. And this raises an interesting question. If diversity was so fundamental to human health, what happens when that diversity is suddenly dramatically reduced? The answer, as we will explore in detail, is that the body begins to show the signs of its missing inputs. Slowly at first, and then in ways that become visible in bone and tooth growth. Before we leave the question of the Paleolithic diet, it is worth pausing on one more aspect of it that is easy to overlook, the question of cooking. The use of fire to prepare food is, in evolutionary terms, one of the most important developments in human history. Yes, the anthropologist Richard Wrangham has argued persuasively that cooking was not simply a convenience, but a biological catalyst. That the ability to soften and detoxify and pre-digest food through heat dramatically increased the caloric availability of what humans ate, and that this increase in available energy was a major driver of the expansion of the human brain, which is an enormously energy-expensive organ. The brain accounts for only about 2% of body weight, but consumes roughly 20% of the body's total energy budget. Feeding a brain of this size requires a caloric surplus that raw food alone, in most environments, cannot easily provide. Cooking made us, in a meaningful sense, who we are. It allowed us to eat a wider range of foods, to kill parasites and pathogens, to make starchy roots digestible, to extract more nutrition from meat. And Paleolithic hunter-gatherers were expert cooks in their own way, not with the stoves and ovens of later civilization, but with fire and stone and the knowledge of how to use them. Roasting, boiling in animal skin or bark vessels, earth oven cooking, the slow rendering of fat. These techniques were part of the Paleolithic culinary repertoire, and they contributed to the nutritional richness of the Paleolithic diet. But let us stay for a little longer in the Paleolithic world, because there is more to understand about the environment that shaped our bodies before we can fully appreciate what happened when that environment changed. The climate of the Paleolithic was not uniform or stable. Our species evolved and spread across the planet during the Pleistocene epoch, a period characterized by repeated cycles of glaciation and warming, by dramatic shifts in sea level and landscape, by the periodic expansion and contraction of forests and grasslands and deserts. Human groups migrating out of Africa crossed environments of extraordinary variability. The just grasslands of the Levant, the cold steppes of Central Asia, the dense forests of Southeast Asia, the frozen tundra of Siberia, and eventually the glaciated corridors of the Americas. Each of these environments presented its own challenges and its own resources, and human bodies, combined with human culture, human technology, and human social organization, adapted to each of them with remarkable flexibility. This adaptability is itself one of the defining characteristics of our species, and it is one of the reasons that Homo sapiens spread so successfully across the planet when other hominin species did not. We are, in a very deep biological sense, generalists. Our bodies are built for variability, for the capacity to process a wide range of foods and survive a wide range of good conditions. The Paleolithic diet was varied not only across species but across seasons and years. In times of abundance, when large animals were plentiful, when fruit trees were heavy with produce, when tubers grew thick in the soil, humans ate richly and accumulated some reserve. In leaner seasons they ate less, moved further, relied on knowledge of the landscape to find resources that others might miss. This cyclical pattern of relative abundance and relative scarcity was not, for a well-adapted body, catastrophic. It was, in a meaningful sense, expected. The human metabolism had been shaped by millions of years of exactly this pattern. It knew what to do with it. The landscapes themselves were extraordinarily rich by the standards of what would come later. Before the agricultural revolution cleared vast tracts of forest and grassland, before overgrazing and soil depletion and monoculture farming simplified and impoverished the ecological complexity of the land, the environments that Paleolithic humans inhabited teemed with life. Megafauna, enormous mammals of kinds that no longer exist, roamed the grasslands of every continent. Woolly mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses moved through the cold steppes of Eurasia. Giant ground sloths and mastodons wandered the Americas. Cave lions and cave bears inhabited the forests of Europe. Giant wombats and diprotodons grazed the grasslands of Australia. Salmon ran in rivers that are now depleted. Shellfish beds lined coastlines for miles. Forests were thick with game and rich with edible plants. The sheer biomass of the Pleistocene world, the total weight of living things per square kilometre of land, was vastly greater than what remains today, and it represented an extraordinarily rich resource base for a human population that numbered, in the entire world, only perhaps a few 100,000 individuals. This low population density relative to the available resources is itself a crucial part of the Paleolithic health picture. Hunter-gatherers were not, in most times and places, competing desperately with each other for scarce resources. The landscape was, in many environments, genuinely abundant relative to the number of people trying to live from it. The notion of chronic food scarcity as the defining condition of Paleolithic life is, as we have noted, largely a myth, one that persisted because of our natural tendency to assume that more primitive must mean more desperate, more precarious, more hungry. The reality, as the skeletal evidence confirms and as studies of living hunter-gatherers support, was often something quite different. A life of moderate effort, genuine diversity of nutrition, and a relationship with the landscape that was characterized more by knowledge and attentiveness than by desperate struggle. It was not an easy life, in any simple sense, but it was a life to which the human body was exquisitely matched, and that match, that alignment between the needs of the organism and the provisions of the environment, produced bodies of remarkable strength and resilience. The average height of Paleolithic Homo sapiens in Europe, based on hundreds of skeletal measurements, was approximately 5 feet 9 or 10 inches, for men and 5 feet 5 inches for women. These are measurements that will be entirely unremarkable in a modern European population. In fact, the average height in many modern European countries only returned to Paleolithic levels in the 20th century, after centuries of being substantially lower. This fact alone is worth sitting with quietly for a moment. The people who lived in Europe before farming began were, on average, as tall as modern Europeans, and the people who came after them, the farmers, the peasants, the villagers, were often significantly shorter for thousands of years. The world these tall, healthy, mobile people lived in was slowly and then more rapidly changing. The climate was shifting again, warming as the last great glaciation receded, reshaping coastlines and forests and the distribution of animal populations, and human groups, responding to these changes and to changes in their own numbers and to social arrangements, were beginning to experiment with new ways of relating to food and land. That experiment would change everything, but not in the short and medium term for the better. It's worth pausing here, before we move forward in time, to consider one more aspect of the Paleolithic world that had profound health implications: the nature of population density. Hunter-gatherer bands, scattered across vast territories and constrained in size by the carrying capacity of their land, lived at population densities that were, by later standards, extraordinarily low. A square kilometre of rich Paleolithic landscape might support a fraction of a person. An entire region that would later sustain a medieval city of tens of thousands might have held only a few hundred Paleolithic inhabitants. This low density had a consequence that was, from a health perspective, enormously significant. The great infectious diseases that have plagued agricultural and urban human populations, smallpox, measles, influenza, plague, typhus, cholera, are diseases that require large, dense populations to sustain themselves. They spread from person to person, and if the group of potential hosts is too small and too dispersed, the disease burns out before it can establish itself. Small bands of hunter-gatherers moving across wide landscapes were substantially protected from epidemic disease simply by the fact of their dispersal. An illness might strike a band and kill several members, but it could not spread to hundreds or thousands of people in the way it could in a village or a town. When agriculture created large, dense, sedentary populations, people living in close proximity to each other and to their domesticated animals, drawing water from sources that were easily contaminated by their own waste. The epidemiological landscape changed completely. The great infections found, for the first time, the conditions they needed to flourish, and they did flourish with devastating results. Medieval European populations experienced wave after wave of epidemic disease, not only the famous plague pandemics that are well known to history, but a constant background burden of infectious illness that was a significant source of early death and chronic ill health throughout the medieval period. The Paleolithic hunter-gatherer, standing in their low-density landscape, eating their diverse diet and moving their strong body through the day, was protected by their very way of life from many of the most serious threats that would later overwhelm their farming descendants. It is a protection that does not appear in any list of advantages. It left no monuments and no texts, but it was real, and the bones of those ancient people quietly confirm it. Let us spend some time now thinking carefully about what daily life actually looked like for a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer. Not in dramatic or heroic terms. The hunt is always over-romanticised, always turned into something more cinematic than it actually was. but in the slow, ordinary texture of everyday existence. A band of hunter-gatherers in the late Paleolithic, the period we are most concerned with, roughly 15 to 30,000 years ago in Europe, or equivalent periods on other continents, typically consisted of between 15 and 50 individuals. This group size is not arbitrary. It reflects the carrying capacity of the landscape, the social complexity that humans can maintain through direct personal relationships, and the practical logistics of moving through and exploiting a territory effectively. These were not isolated groups, entirely cut off from others. Hunter-gatherer bands existed within networks of neighbouring groups, with whom they exchanged members through marriage, shared information about resources, gathered for seasonal ceremonies and social events. But the basic unit of daily life was the small band, the group of people who ate together, slept near each other, shared the work of finding and preparing food, and bore collective responsibility for the care of children and the vulnerable. The daily routine of such a group was, by modern standards, strikingly unhurried. Anthropologists who have studied contemporary and historically documented hunter-gatherer societies, including the Kipchak-Kungsan of southern Africa, the Hadza of Tanzania, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, and many others, have consistently found that the actual time spent in activities directly related to food acquisition rarely exceeds 4 to 6 hours per day for most adults. The rest of the day, and this is a finding that consistently surprises people when they first encounter it, was spent in rest, in social interaction, in the making and maintaining of tools and clothing and shelter, in storytelling and music and the various ritual practices that gave meaning and structure to group life. This is worth lingering on because it is so counterintuitive to modern sensibilities. 4 to 6 hours per day of subsistence-related labour, not 10 hours, not 12, 4 to 6. And the remaining waking hours of the day, perhaps 8 or 9 more hours of daylight and firelight, were available for everything else. Conversation, play, craft, ceremony, music, rest, exploration, and whatever other activities the members of the group found satisfying or necessary. The image of the ancient human as a creature perpetually on the edge of starvation, spending every waking moment in frantic pursuit of enough to eat, is simply not supported by the evidence of how living hunter-gatherers actually spend their time. This was the observation that prompted the anthropologist Marshall Salins in the 1960s and 1970s to describe hunter-gatherers as living in the original affluent society. Not affluent in the material sense, they owned very little, and what they owned they could carry, but affluent in time, rich in the hours of a day, able to meet their material needs without consuming the entirety of their waking lives in labour. This is a deeply counterintuitive finding, and it is worth examining carefully. We tend to assume that life in the ancient past was defined by a constant struggle for survival, by an unrelenting effort to find enough to eat. The images of humans perpetually on the edge, perpetually exhausted by the basic business of staying alive. But this image is largely wrong, at least for healthy adults in a reasonably well-stocked environment. The reason is efficiency. A small group of people with detailed knowledge of their local landscape, with refined skills for tracking and hunting and gathering, with an accumulated store of knowledge about where things grow and when and in what quantities. Such a group can, in many environments, meet its nutritional needs in a surprisingly short amount of time. Not every day, and not in every season. Lean times existed, and in truly harsh environments or truly difficult seasons, the work of food acquisition could be exhausting and all-consuming. But as an average across the year, the picture is one of moderate labour and substantial leisure. The contrast with medieval peasant life could not be more stark, and it is one we will return to in detail. But for now, let us continue to build the picture of Paleolithic daily life, because understanding it fully is essential to understanding what was lost when farming replaced it. The gathering side of the Paleolithic economy was primarily, though not exclusively, the domain of women, and it was nutritionally the more reliable and often the more productive part of the food supply. Plant foods, roots, tubers, nuts, fruits, seeds, leaves, provided the majority of calories in most hunter-gatherer diets, except in extreme environments like the high Arctic, where plant availability was severely limited. Women moved through the landscape in small groups, often with children in tow, building and sharing an encyclopedic knowledge of the local flora. They knew which roots were edible and which were toxic. They knew which berries were ripe in which microhabitats and at what time of year. They knew how deep to dig for tubers in different soil types and how to process certain plants to remove toxins before eating them. This knowledge was not trivial. It represented the accumulated botanical learning of generations, passed from mothers and grandmothers and aunts to daughters, stored not in libraries or written texts, but in the living memory of experienced individuals and in the cultural practices of the group. The loss of this knowledge, which happened progressively as agricultural societies displaced hunter-gatherers, and as the knowledge became irrelevant to lives lived on farms, is one of the great uncounted losses of the agricultural revolution. The hunting side of the Paleolithic economy was more variable in its returns. A successful hunt could provide an enormous quantity of protein and fat at once, more than the group could consume before it spoiled, requiring rapid eating or the sharing of meat with allied groups. An unsuccessful hunt, and many hunts were unsuccessful, provided nothing. The hunting of large game in particular was a high-reward enterprise, requiring significant expenditure of energy, cooperation among hunters, and a degree of luck or skill or both that could not be guaranteed. But the skills required for hunting were extraordinary. The tracking of animals through varied terrain, the reading of signs invisible to untrained eyes, a bent stem, a disturbed patch of soil, a faint warmth in a footprint, required years of learning and a quality of attention that is almost meditative in its intensity. Hunters described by anthropologists speak of a state of focused calm, a kind of absorption in the landscape that has something in common with the quality of mind cultivated by long meditation practice. The landscape was not a backdrop to their lives. It was the substance of their lives, intimately known and continuously attended to. The cooperation required for large game hunting is itself worth dwelling on, because it was a social and cognitive achievement of considerable complexity. A successful communal hunt required the coordination of multiple individuals across space and time, the ability to anticipate the behavior of animals, to communicate silently across distances, to maintain formation and timing in the execution of a plan that might have been months in the preparation. The social bonds that made this coordination possible were not incidental to the hunt. They were its foundation. And the hunt in turn reinforced and deepened those bonds, creating shared experiences of effort and risk and success or failure that bound the hunters to each other in ways that went beyond simple pragmatic alliance. There is also the question of what happened after a successful hunt, and this is something that tends to be underappreciated in popular accounts of Paleolithic life. The sharing of meat was not merely a practical matter of food distribution. It was, in virtually every documented hunter-gatherer society, a deeply social and often ceremonially significant act. The rules governing who received which parts of which animal, who had obligations to whom and in what order, who could take credit for the kill and who could not. These rules varied enormously across cultures, but they shared a common function. They transformed the biological act of eating into a social act of relationship and obligation. They created the web of reciprocity that held the group together through the inevitable fluctuations of fortune. You shared your abundance today because you might need to receive another's abundance tomorrow. The ethic of sharing was not altruism in the abstract sense. It was a rational and effective strategy for managing risk in a world where individual fortune was unpredictable, but collective support was reliable. The diet that resulted from all this gathering and hunting was, as we have noted, extraordinarily diverse. But it had other characteristics worth noting. It was low in refined carbohydrates and in simple sugars. The sweetest things available were wild honey, available occasionally and with difficulty, and ripe fruit, available seasonally. The carbohydrates that made up the diet came primarily from roots and tubers, and from the natural sugars in intact fruits, sources that also came packaged with fiber, which slows digestion and moderates the glucose response. This meant that blood sugar levels remained relatively stable, without the sharp spikes and crashes that characterize a diet heavy in refined grains. It was also high in what we would now call dietary fiber. The roots, tubers, leaves, and whole plant foods that made up such a large part of the diet were extraordinarily fiber-rich by modern standards. Estimates suggest that Paleolithic humans consumed perhaps 8 to 10 times the fiber that average modern adults eat today. This fiber was the foundation of a gut microbiome of extraordinary diversity and complexity, a community of hundreds of microbial species living in the digestive tract, processing food, supporting immune function, producing compounds that influence everything from inflammation levels to mood. And this is something we are only beginning to understand deeply, that the gut microbiome is not a peripheral feature of human biology, but a central one. The microbial community in the human gut is so large, so metabolically active, and so deeply integrated into human physiology, that some researchers speak of it as a kind of second organ. That organ was shaped over hundreds of thousands of years by exposure to an enormous diversity of plant foods, exactly what the Paleolithic diet provided, and exactly what the diets of many later agricultural populations did not. To understand why microbiome diversity matters so profoundly for health, it is helpful to think about what these microbial communities actually do. The bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms that populate the human gut are not passive passengers. They are active participants in human physiology. They digest complex plant fibers that human enzymes cannot process, producing short-chain fatty acids that nourish the cells lining the colon and reduce systemic inflammation. They synthesize certain vitamins, including vitamin K2, which is essential for proper calcium deposition in bone, and various B vitamins, that the human body cannot manufacture itself. They train and calibrate the immune system, helping it distinguish between genuine threats and harmless substances. They produce neurotransmitter precursors and communicate with the nervous system through the gut-brain axis in ways that influence mood, anxiety, and even cognitive function. A gut microbiome depleted of diversity, as happens when dietary variety is reduced, when the fiber that feeds diverse microbial communities is absent, when the constant stream of novel plant compounds that stimulate microbial growth disappears, becomes less able to perform these functions, the immune system loses some of its calibration, inflammation increases at baseline, the production of beneficial metabolites declines, the overall physiological support that a healthy microbiome provides to every system in the body is quietly diminished. None of this shows up in a single dramatic symptom. It shows up as a general reduction in resilience, slightly lower baseline of health, a marginally higher susceptibility to the illnesses and stresses that the body encounters. And over a lifetime, these small reductions accumulate into the differences that archaeologists can measure in bone and tooth. There is another dimension of Paleolithic life that belongs in this picture, and it is one that modern medicine is increasingly recognizing as important: social connection. The small band structure of hunter-gatherer life meant that individuals were almost never truly alone. From birth to death, a person in a Paleolithic band was embedded in a web of close relationships, with family, with friends made in childhood and maintained throughout life, with the elders who held the group's accumulated knowledge, and the young people who would one day inherit it. The care of children was genuinely communal, with multiple adults, not only parents. It involved the feeding, protection, and teaching of each child. The elderly, as long as they could contribute knowledge and skill to the group, were valued and cared for. This constant social embedding had physiological consequences. Chronic loneliness, as modern research has made abundantly clear, is a powerful driver of inflammation and poor health outcomes. The social isolation that characterizes so much of modern life, and that characterized, in different ways, much of peasant life, with its long days of solitary labour in fields, was largely absent from the Paleolithic band. People were together, not always harmoniously, of course. Small groups in close quarters generate their share of conflict and friction, but those together, embedded in relationships, held within a social fabric that was itself a form of protection against the biological costs of isolation. And this raises an interesting question, one that's worth holding gently before we move on. If the social environment of the Paleolithic was so consistently embedded and relational, what did the transition to farming do to that social fabric? The answer is complex and varied by region and time, but there are some consistent patterns worth noting. Agricultural life, particularly in its early phases, created new kinds of social inequality that hunter-gatherer societies largely lacked. When people settle permanently in one place, land and stored resources become things that can be owned, accumulated, and passed on. The concept of heritable wealth, of some families having more than others not because of skill or effort in the immediate moment, but because of what had been accumulated across generations, became possible for the first time. And with wealth came hierarchy. The families with the largest grain stores or the most productive fields gradually accumulated social power over those with less, creating the stratified societies that would characterize agricultural civilizations for thousands of years. The health consequences of this stratification are visible in the archaeological record. In many early agricultural sites, there is significant variation in the skeletal health indicators across burials, evidence that some individuals ate much better than others, that some were more protected from disease and from physical hard labour. The egalitarianism of the hunter-gatherer band, in which food was shared and no individual could accumulate vastly more than any other, gave way, gradually and then more completely to a world in which the connection between effort and outcome was broken, in which the hardest working bodies often ate the worst, and the most leisured bodies ate the best. The medieval peasant was the inheritor of this long trend. Embedded in a feudal system that organised social relations explicitly around the extraction of labour from the many for the benefit of the few, the medieval rural poor worked longer hours than almost any human population before or since, and did so on diets that were, for significant portions of the year, genuinely inadequate. The combination, maximum labour, minimum nutrition, was precisely the worst possible for the human body. And the bones of the medieval poor record, this combination with the relentless clarity, or all of these features of Paleolithic life, the movement, the dietary diversity, the moderate labour, the social richness, the absence of refined carbohydrates, the high fibre intake, the constant but varied physical engagement with the landscape, combined to produce bodies of remarkable health. And then the world changed. The human body is, in the most literal sense, a product of its past. Every cell, every organ, every metabolic pathway and hormonal cascade and immune response is the output of a process that has been running for billions of years and that has been shaped, in its most recent chapters, by the specific conditions of Paleolithic life. Understanding what the body was built to expect, or what it performs optimally on, is essential to understanding why it faltered when those expectations went unmet. Let us begin with the skeleton, because it is the skeleton that gives us our most direct evidence of the health differences between Stone Age and medieval populations. Bone is not an inert structure. It's living tissue, constantly being remodelled, broken down and rebuilt by cells called osteoclasts and osteoblasts in a continuous process that responds to mechanical loading, nutritional status, hormonal signals, and age. Dense, strong bone is the product of adequate calcium and vitamin D and other minerals, of sufficient protein intake, of regular mechanical loading through physical activity, and of hormonal balance, particularly the sex hormones, which play a crucial role in maintaining bone density throughout adult life. Paleolithic skeletons across multiple sites and regions consistently show high bone density. The cortical thickness of long bones, the thickness of the solid outer wall of bones like the femur and tibia, is typically greater in Paleolithic remains than in later agricultural populations from the same regions. Muscle attachment sites on the bones, the roughened areas where tendons and ligaments connect, are often dramatically more pronounced, indicating larger and more developed muscle mass. The joints show wear consistent with high physical activity, but not with the specific repetitive strain injuries that would become common among agricultural workers. The teeth are another extraordinary window into Paleolithic health. Dental health is remarkably sensitive to diet and nutrition, and the teeth preserved in ancient skeletal remains carry a surprisingly detailed record of the diet and health of the person who owned them. Paleolithic teeth across hundreds of specimens show consistently low rates of dental caries. The bacterial tooth decay that results primarily from the fermentation of simple sugars and refined carbohydrates. Some studies of Paleolithic dental remains from European sites found caries rates of less than 5%, compared to rates of 30 to 40% or more in early agricultural populations eating grain-based diets. The reason is simple and direct. Bacteria that cause tooth decay feed primarily on simple sugars and refined starches, A diet dominated by protein, fat, and fibrous plant foods gives these bacteria relatively little to work with. Paleolithic teeth also show straighter alignment than is typical of agricultural and modern populations. This is not a trivial observation. The alignment of teeth in the jaw is determined by the interaction between genetic factors and the mechanical forces experienced by the jaw during development. And those mechanical forces are substantially influenced by diet. A diet that requires prolonged chewing of tough, fibrous, unprocessed foods stimulates the development of a broader, more robustly developed jaw, which provides adequate space for all the teeth to erupt without crowding. The shift to softer, cooked, processed foods, which began gradually in the Paleolithic with the use of fire but accelerated dramatically with agriculture, progressively reduced the mechanical stimulation of the jaw during development, resulting in narrower dental arches and the crowding that makes of impacted wisdom teeth. Orthodontic treatment and dental malocclusion so common in modern populations. Now let us think about the metabolic biology of Paleolithic versus agricultural diets, because this is where some of the most important health differences originate. The human metabolism, the entire system by which food is converted to energy, and the energy is distributed and stored, was shaped by the nutritional environment of the Paleolithic. It was shaped for variability, for periodic abundance and periodic scarcity, for a diet rich in protein and fat and diverse, complex carbohydrates and relatively low in simple sugars. And it was shaped in particular for the kind of alternating feast and lean that characterized life as a hunter-gatherer. When a Paleolithic band made a successful large kill, they ate richly. Enormous quantities of meat, fat, organ meats, foods dense in protein, fat-soluble vitamins and essential fatty acids. The body stored what it could of the excess and used the rest immediately. And then, in the days that followed, as the meat ran out and hunting began again, the stored reserves were drawn upon and the body shifted metabolic gears, becoming more efficient, more conservative, drawing on fat stores and preserving muscle mass in ways that a well-adapted metabolism handles gracefully. This metabolic flexibility, the ability to shift smoothly between using glucose for fuel when carbohydrates are available, and using fat for fuel or when they are not, is a fundamental feature of the human metabolism. It is, in a very real sense, a design specification, and it functions well when the diet provides the conditions that allow it to operate as designed. When carbohydrate intake is not chronically elevated, when protein intake is adequate, when the body has regular periods of lower caloric intake that allow fat-burning pathways to remain active and efficient. What happens when the diet changes to one dominated by grain? When carbohydrate intake becomes chronically high, and when the carbohydrates in question are refined and easily digested? The answer, worked out over decades of nutritional and metabolic research, is that metabolic flexibility gradually deteriorates. The body becomes accustomed to using glucose as its primary fuel and loses some of its capacity to shift efficiently into fat-burning mode. Insulin, the hormone that regulates glucose uptake by cells, becomes chronically elevated. Cells gradually become less sensitive to its signals. The entire metabolic system begins to operate under a kind of low-grade stress that, sustained over years and decades, contributes to a wide range of health problems. For early agricultural populations, this shift was not the elegant metabolic transition it might sound in abstract terms. It was change forced upon bodies by necessity, by the gradual disappearance of the wide-ranging dietary variety of the Paleolithic, replaced by the narrow monotony of a grain-based diet, and the bodies of those early farmers showed the consequences in their bones and their teeth and their growth. Let us think about what specific nutrients were affected by this dietary transition. Grain-based diets, while providing substantial calories in the form of carbohydrates, are actually quite poor sources of several critical nutrients. They are low in fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E and vitamin K2, which are found primarily in animal foods and in certain plant foods that are less prominent in agricultural diets. They are low in the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids that are essential for brain development and function, and for the regulation of inflammation. They are often low in zinc and iron in bioavailable forms. Grain contains these minerals, but it also contains compounds called phytates that bind to them and prevent absorption. And critically, grain-based diets were often deficient in essential amino acids. Grains are incomplete proteins. They lack or are low in certain amino acids that the body cannot synthesize on its own and must obtain from diet. Without adequate animal protein to complement grain-based calories, early agricultural populations were at risk of protein deficiency even when they were technically consuming enough total calories. This kind of deficiency, getting enough energy but not enough of the specific building blocks the body needs, has particularly severe consequences for growing children whose rapidly developing bodies require adequate protein and micronutrients for healthy growth. And here is something worth considering carefully, because it speaks to a subtlety in the nutritional picture that is easy to miss. The problem for many early agricultural populations was not that they had nothing to eat. They often had plenty of calories, at least in good years. Grain was, after all, a relatively calorie-dense food that could be stored and transported, which was precisely why it was so valuable. The problem was that they had plenty of the wrong kind of calories. Plenty of carbohydrate energy, delivered in a form the body was not well designed to process in large quantities over long periods of time, and insufficient quantities of the protein, fat, vitamins and minerals the body needed to use that energy effectively, to grow bones and muscles and immune cells and all the other structures of a healthy organism. This distinction between caloric sufficiency and nutritional sufficiency is one that modern nutritional science has spent decades learning to articulate, and it is one that the medieval peasant lived without ever being able to name. They were not starving in the catastrophic sense, but they were chronically, subtly, persistently undernourished in ways that their bodies recorded faithfully in the slow languages of bone and tooth and growth. The result of all of these nutritional shortfalls, sustained across childhoods and lifetimes, was visible in a very specific and measurable way: stunted growth. Short stature in skeletal populations is one of the most reliable indicators of chronic childhood malnutrition. When the body does not receive adequate protein and micronutrients during the critical growing years, it does not grow to its genetic potential. The bones of the legs and spine do not reach the length they would reach in a well-nourished child. And this shortfall is preserved forever in the skeleton, available to be measured by archaeologists thousands of years later. This is precisely what the archaeological record shows in population after population. After the transition to agriculture, average heights dropped, often substantially. In some European populations, the average male height fell by 2 to 4 inches after the adoption of farming. This was not a genetic change. The genetic potential for height had not changed. It was a nutritional change. The same bodies receiving different fuel produce different results. Vitamin D deserves particular attention in this context because its story is unusually clear and well documented. Vitamin D is produced in the skin in response to ultraviolet light from the sun, but is also obtained in smaller quantities from certain foods, particularly fatty fish and organ meats. In populations with adequate sun exposure and adequate dietary sources, vitamin D deficiency was rare. But as agricultural populations became more sedentary, spending more time indoors or in the shade of buildings and working conditions, and as their diets became more grain-centred and less rich in animal foods that provide dietary vitamin D, deficiency became common. The consequences were severe. In children, vitamin D deficiency causes rickets, a condition in which the bones fail to calcify properly and become soft and deformable. The leg bones bow outward under the weight of the body. The chest becomes misshapen. Growth is impaired. In adults, vitamin D deficiency causes osteomalacia, a softening of the bones that makes them fragile and prone to fracture, and that causes chronic musculoskeletal pain. Skeletal evidence of rickets and osteomalacia appears with significant frequency in medieval European populations and is essentially absent from Paleolithic remains. The immune system is another area where the consequences of the nutritional transition were profound. The human immune system, like every other system in the body, requires specific inputs to function well. It requires adequate zinc and vitamin C and vitamin A and iron and selenium and a host of other micronutrients that were plentiful in the diverse Paleolithic diet and often deficient in grain-heavy agricultural diets. An immune system that is nutritionally compromised is less able to respond effectively to infection. And agricultural populations living in dense settlements near their domestic animals and their own waste were exposed to infections at rates and of kinds that Paleolithic hunter-gatherers rarely encountered. There is also the question of inflammation, the body's basic response to injury and infection, which when chronically activated underlies a vast range of diseases. The balance between pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory signals in the body is profoundly influenced by diet, particularly by the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids, and by the presence or absence of various anti-inflammatory phytonutrients found in wild plants. Paleolithic diets rich in omega-3 fatty acids from fish and game, and in diverse plant phytonutrients, likely maintained a relatively anti-inflammatory baseline. Grain-heavy agricultural diets, lower in omega-3s and in phytonutrient diversity, shifted this balance in the direction of more chronic inflammation, contributing over time to the joint degeneration, cardiovascular disease, and metabolic dysfunction that become increasingly visible in agricultural skeletal populations. There is one further piece of the biological picture that deserves its own careful attention because it connects so many of the other threads we have been following. The question of sleep. The human sleep cycle, its length, its structure, its relationship to darkness and light and temperature was shaped by the Paleolithic world. Hunter-gatherers slept in ways that were deeply embedded in the natural rhythms of day and night, governed by the movement of the sun and the quality of the light and the temperature of the air. They slept in groups close together, sharing warmth and providing a degree of collective safety that allowed the nervous system to rest more completely. They had no artificial light to extend the day beyond what the sun provided, and so their sleep was long, dark, and deeply synchronized with the natural cycle. Sleep, as modern sleep science has established with increasing precision, is one of the most fundamental requirements of human biological health. During sleep, the brain clears metabolic waste products through the lymphatic system, a recently discovered network of channels that flushes the brain with cerebrospinal fluid during deep sleep, removing the cellular debris that accumulates during waking hours, and that, if not cleared, may contribute to neurodegenerative disease. During sleep, growth hormone is released, and the rebuilding of muscle and bone tissue occurs. The immune system is calibrated and its memory is consolidated. Emotional experiences are processed and integrated. The entire system, physical, neurological, immunological, undergoes a kind of reset that is essential for full functioning. Medieval peasants, labouring from before dawn to after dusk through the long summer days, that confined by cold and darkness through the winter months, had a complex relationship with sleep that was shaped by the agricultural calendar in ways that Paleolithic sleep was not. The long summer days demanded waking before sunrise and working until last light. The winter provided more darkness, and there is evidence from historical and anthropological sources that pre-industrial populations in northern climates sometimes slept in two distinct intervals during the long winter nights, with a period of quiet wakefulness in the middle, a pattern that has been described in historical sources as a well-recognized feature of the night. So this segmented sleep, what the historian Roger E. Kirch has called first sleep and second sleep, may itself reflect a natural human sleep pattern that was disrupted by the artificial extension of the day through firelight and later electric light. Whether or not Paleolithic hunters also practiced segmented sleep is not something we can know directly. But what we do know is that their sleep was long, dark, physically grounded, and socially embedded, and that chronic sleep deprivation, which is endemic in modern populations and was certainly present in the overworked medieval labouring poor, is one of the most powerful drivers of immune suppression, metabolic dysfunction, and accelerated physical decline that exists. All of this biology, the bone density and the tooth decay, the metabolic flexibility and the inflammatory baseline, the immune function and the growth potential, the sleep quality and the gut microbiome, tells a coherent story. The human body was built for a particular kind of input, and when it received a different kind, it functioned differently. Not immediately, not catastrophically in most cases, but perceptibly, measurably, in ways that show up thousands of years later in the careful measurements of researchers working quietly in laboratories, comparing the bones of the ancient past to the bones of the more recent past. The physical evidence to the health differences between Stone Age and medieval populations is not theoretical. It is not the product of assumption or model building. It exists in bone and tooth and sediment, recoverable by archaeology, measurable by science, and it has been accumulating in research collections and published studies for the better part of a century. Let us walk through some of the most important sites and findings, slowly and without hurry, because the details are genuinely illuminating. One of the foundational studies in this area was conducted by the biological anthropologist J. Lawrence Angel, who spent decades in the mid-20th century measuring and analysing skeletal remains from the eastern Mediterranean, a region with a rich archaeological record spanning from the Paleolithic through the Bronze Age and beyond. Angel's work, published across many papers and eventually synthesized in broader reviews, established what has since been confirmed many times over, that the transition to agriculture in the eastern Mediterranean was accompanied by a significant and measurable decline in skeletal health indicators. The Paleolithic hunter-gatherers of the region represented by skeletal remains from sites in Greece, Turkey, and the surrounding areas, had an average male height of approximately 5 feet 10 inches. Their skeletal remains showed robust bone structure, good dental health with low rates of caries, and relatively few of the signs of chronic stress that would appear in later populations. After the transition to farming, a transition that occurred in this region roughly 10,000 years ago, average male height dropped to approximately 5 feet 6 inches or less. Dental caries rates increased substantially. Evidence of enamel hypoplasia, visible lines in tooth enamel that form when growth is disrupted by illness or malnutrition during tooth development, became more common. These enamel defects are particularly informative because they form at specific ages during tooth development, allowing researchers to identify periods of childhood stress with considerable precision. The site of Çatalhöyük in central Turkey, one of the best studied early agricultural settlements in the world, provides an exceptionally detailed window into the health of early farming communities. Occupied from roughly 9 to 8,000 years ago, Çatalhöyük was a densely packed settlement of several thousand people living in mud brick houses built directly against one another, with no streets. Inhabitants accessed their homes through holes in the roofs. Analysis of the hundreds of skeletal remains recovered from beneath the floors of these houses, where the dead were often buried, has revealed a population with significant health challenges. Rates of dental caries were high, a direct consequence of a diet dominated by wheat and barley, whose starches fed the bacteria responsible for tooth decay. Evidence of iron deficiency anemia, visible in the skull bones in a characteristic pattern called cribra orbitalia, a porous roughening of the bone around the eye sockets, was found in a substantial proportion of the population, particularly children. Skeletal evidence of infectious disease was more common than in comparable Paleolithic collections, and the bone showed the characteristic changes associated with heavy repetitive labour, the kind of labour involved in the grinding of grain, in the carrying of heavy loads, in the bent-over work of tending fields and making ceramics. What is remarkable about Çatalhöyük, and what makes it such a valuable reference point in this discussion, is that it represents a relatively early and in some ways relatively prosperous agricultural community. The inhabitants were not at the extreme end of agricultural poverty. They had a functioning settlement, they traded with neighbouring communities, they had a rich symbolic and artistic life. The site is famous for its extraordinary wall paintings and its elaborate burial practices, which included the plastering and reuse of human skulls in ritual contexts. And yet even in this early, relatively well-organised agricultural community, the skeletal evidence of nutritional stress and infectious disease is clear and consistent. The transition away from the diverse, mobile, resource-rich Paleolithic lifestyle was already clearly taking a toll on individual bodies, even as it was creating the foundations of a more complex social world. The grinding of grain is particularly worth noting as a source of skeletal evidence. Grinding flour by hand using the kind of stone quern that early agricultural populations relied on requires a specific body position and a specific repetitive motion that places enormous and sustained load on specific joints and muscle groups. The result, visible in the skeletal remains of many early agricultural communities, is a characteristic pattern of joint degeneration in the knees, the lower back, and the toes. The toes because of the way the grinder's weight shifts onto the balls of the feet during the grinding motion. Researchers studying these skeletal changes in early agricultural populations have sometimes been able to identify, with remarkable specificity, individuals whose lives centred on the labour of grain processing based on the pattern of wear in their joints. Yet the contrast with the kinds of skeletal wear seen in Paleolithic remains as instructive. Paleolithic skeletons show the effects of sustained activity across a wide range of movement patterns, the wear of running and climbing and carrying in varied postures, the muscle development of diverse physical engagement. The wear is not absent, but it is different in character. It is the wear of a body used in its full range of motion, rather than the wear of a body confined to narrow, repetitive tasks, repeated thousands of times over years and decades. Moving forward in time to the medieval period that forms the other pole of our comparison tonight, the archaeological evidence is equally rich and in some ways even more striking. Medieval cemeteries across Europe have yielded thousands of skeletal remains, and their systematic study has painted a detailed picture of medieval health that diverges considerably from the romanticized images that popular culture sometimes projects onto that era. It is worth pausing here to consider what additional kinds of evidence archaeologists draw upon beyond the skeleton itself. Coprolites, preserved ancient feces, when found in archaeological contexts, provide extraordinary direct evidence of diet. They have been analysed for plant remains, for parasite eggs, for the chemical signatures of specific foods, and they tell a story of dietary content that is sometimes surprising in its specificity. Dental calculus, the mineralised plaque mentioned earlier, which forms on teeth and can survive for thousands of years, has become in recent decades one of the most productive sources of dietary information available to archaeologists. Modern analysis techniques, including ancient DNA sequencing and protein analysis, can extract from a tiny fragment of dental calculus information about the specific plant and animal species consumed, about the presence of certain cooking practices, about the microbial community in the ancient mouth. The results have been remarkable and have substantially enriched our picture of both Paleolithic and medieval diet. Isotope analysis of bone collagen is another powerful tool. The ratio of different carbon and nitrogen isotopes preserved in bone reflects the diet consumed over the years and decades of bone formation. Different food sources have characteristic isotopic signatures that leave their traces in the bone of those who eat them. Marine foods versus terrestrial foods. The consumption of C4 plants like maize versus C3 plants like wheat. Their relative proportion of animal protein in the diet. All of these can be read with considerable accuracy from the isotopic composition of preserved bone. This technique has allowed researchers to document, in extraordinary detail, the dietary shifts that accompanied the agricultural transition in multiple regions around the world. Medieval European peasants, the majority of the population by far, were short. Average male heights in many medieval European populations range from about 5 feet 4 inches to 5 feet 7 inches, depending on region and period. These figures represent a substantial reduction from Paleolithic levels, and they reflect the cumulative effect of generations of nutritional inadequacy. The medieval diet for the rural poor was dominated by grain, bread, pottage, a kind of thick grain-based porridge or stew, and more bread. Meat was a rarity, consumed primarily on feast days, or when animals were slaughtered in autumn before winter. Dairy was available to some, absent to others. Fruits and vegetables were seasonal and limited. In winter and early spring, the diet contracted to near monotony. Dark bread and stored root vegetables, and whatever preserved meats or fish might be available. The skeletal evidence of this diet is pervasive. Enamel hyperplasia, those markers of childhood stress preserved in the teeth, are found at high rates in medieval skeletal collections, indicating that episodes of significant childhood malnutrition were common rather than exceptional. Evidence of rickets, the vitamin D deficiency disease, appears in medieval skeletal remains from northern Europe, with a frequency that suggests it was widespread, particularly in the centuries when urbanization had begun to reduce sun exposure for working populations. Dental caries rates were high in population, consuming significant quantities of bread and other carbohydrates. Infectious disease left its mark on many bones. Evidence of healed and unhealed infections in the long bones, tuberculosis in the spine, the characteristic erosion of joint surfaces in certain infections. One site in England that has yielded particularly illuminating evidence is the cemetery of St Mary Spital in London, excavated in the 1990s and early 2000s, and representing a population from the 12th through 16th centuries. Analysis of the approximately 11,000 individuals buried there, one of the largest medieval skeletal collections in Britain, revealed a population experiencing significant childhood malnutrition, high rates of infectious disease, and considerable occupational stress in the skeleton. Evidence of scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, was present in a notable proportion of the remains, reflecting diets that lacked fresh fruit and vegetables for extended periods. Evidence of rickets was similarly present. The bones told the story of lives marked by chronic want and chronic physical hardship. Medieval peasant skeletons across Europe share this picture. They typically show dramatic osteophyte formations, the growth of bony spurs at the edges of joint surfaces, in the spine and lower limbs, a consequence of the chronic heavy loading of agricultural work. Muscle attachment sites are strongly marked, indicating well-developed musculature. But unlike the varied, full-body muscle development of Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, the medieval peasant's muscle development often shows the asymmetries and imbalances of repetitive agricultural labour. One arm stronger than the other from years of using a scythe or flail. Back and hip joints worn in patterns consistent with the bent posture of hoeing or reaping. The spine of the medieval labourer in particular tells an eloquent story. Compression fractures of the vertebrae, herniated discs, osteophytic bridging between adjacent vertebrae, the architectural record of a lifetime of carrying and bending under loads too heavy and too constant. There are, of course, significant variations within the medieval period and across regions. Aristocratic and wealthy populations in the medieval world were substantially taller and healthier than the peasant majority. Their skeletons show better nutrition, lower rates of childhood stress markers, and less severe occupational wear. The difference between noble and peasant skeletons in some medieval collections is striking enough to allow researchers to make educated guesses about social class based on skeletal indicators alone. The noble skeleton is taller and denser than the peasant's, approaching but rarely quite reaching the robust fullness of the Paleolithic hunter. This is itself a significant observation, that in the agricultural era, health became stratified in ways that it had not been in the more egalitarian hunter-gatherer world. And it suggests again that the issue was not farming itself, but the conditions under which most farming people lived. conditions of extraction and inequality that left the bodies doing the work poorly resourced for the demands being placed upon them. What is remarkable about the overall archaeological picture is its consistency across regions and time periods. From the first agricultural settlements of the Fertile Crescent to the farming villages of early China and South Asia, from the maize-dependent cultures of pre-Columbian North America to the wheat and barley economies of prehistoric Europe, the same pattern appears again and again. The transition to agriculture was accompanied by a measurable decline in average height, an increase in dental caries and other markers of poor nutrition, a rise in evidence of infectious disease, and the appearance of new forms of skeletal wear associated with heavy repetitive labour. The bodies of agricultural populations across cultures and continents tell a consistent story of lives that were in important ways harder and in important biological ways worse than the lives of the hunter-gatherers who preceded them. And so we arrive at the present, at the world we actually live in, which is neither the Paleolithic nor the medieval period, but something new and strange in its own ways, something that our bodies are still in the process of adjusting to, imperfectly and with consequences we're still learning to see. It would be too simple and too wrong to say that modern humans are simply replicating the mistakes of medieval peasants at larger scale. The 20th century brought extraordinary improvements in nutrition and public health, the elimination of many infectious diseases through vaccination and sanitation, the correction of many specific nutritional deficiencies through food fortification and improved food distribution, dramatic reductions in childhood mortality, increases in average life expectancy that are genuinely remarkable by any historical standard. Modern humans in wealthy countries are, on average, taller than medieval peasants. They have better teeth, better bones, and live far longer. But the story is not simply one of linear progress, and the comparison with Paleolithic health remains illuminating in ways that are directly relevant to the bodies and lives of people alive today. Consider first the question of dietary diversity. Modern food systems have, in many ways, achieved the opposite of what the Paleolithic diet provided. Despite the bewildering variety of foods available in a modern supermarket, the hundreds of products on the shelves, the global range of options, the year-round availability of fruits and vegetables from every corner of the world, the actual diversity of the foods that underlie those products is remarkably narrow. Global agriculture is dominated by a tiny number of crops: wheat, rice, maize, soybean, and a handful of others. The majority of human calories worldwide come from fewer than a dozen plant species, compared to the hundreds or thousands that hunter-gatherers drew upon. And the processing of those crops into the shelf-stable, palatable products that fill modern diets further reduces their nutritional complexity. The gut microbiome consequences of this reduced dietary diversity are becoming increasingly apparent in modern research. Studies comparing the gut microbiomes of people in industrialized societies with those of people in traditional hunter-gatherer societies, or of people eating diverse, fiber-rich, minimal processed diets with those eating standard Western diets, consistently find dramatic differences in microbial diversity. The industrialized gut microbiome is, in many measurable ways, impoverished compared to the Paleolithic gut microbiome that it replaced, containing fewer species, with less metabolic diversity, and with consequences for immune function and inflammation that researchers are still mapping out. Consider, second, the question of physical activity. Modern humans in wealthy countries are, on average, among the most sedentary humans who have ever lived. The average American adult walks fewer than 4,000 steps per day, a small fraction of the 10 to 15,000 that characterize Paleolithic daily life and that contemporary public health guidelines recommend as a minimum for basic health maintenance. The collapse of physical activity in modern life is not simply the result of laziness or poor choices. It is the structural outcome of an economy organized around sitting, around the desk and the screen and the car and the couch. The landscape of modern life has been engineered for the convenience of bodies that need not move, and most bodies have obliged. The skeletal consequences are visible in modern populations. Bone density in modern Western adults is lower, on average, than in Paleolithic populations and in populations that maintain higher levels of physical activity. Rates of osteoporosis, the disease of dangerously low bone density, are high in modern elderly populations and are increasing. The joints of modern humans show less of the robust wear of Paleolithic skeletal material and more of the specific degeneration associated with sitting, the forward head posture and compressed cervical vertebrae of screen use, the hip flexor tightness, and spinal degeneration of prolonged sitting, the weak glutes and back muscles of a body rarely asked to move in its full range. Consider, third, the profound irony of our current relationship with food. We live in a world of extraordinary caloric abundance, the first in human history in which more people die from the diseases of overconsumption than from starvation. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome. These conditions, essentially absent from Paleolithic populations and in many agricultural populations, have become the dominant chronic health challenges of the modern world, and they are, in many cases, the product of the mismatch between the diet the modern food environment provides and the diet the human metabolism was shaped to handle. The same metabolic flexibility that allowed Paleolithic humans to navigate cycles of feast and famine becomes, in an environment of constant abundant food, particularly constant abundant simple carbohydrates, a liability rather than an asset. There is a certain quiet sadness in this realization. The human body, so exquisitely adapted to its ancient world, so capable and resilient in the environments it was shaped for, finds itself in a novel world to which it is still adapting. The adaptations that kept us alive for hundreds of thousands of years, the love of sweetness that directed us toward energy, rich fruit, the preference for fat that drove us toward nutrient-dense animal foods, the drive to eat when food was available because scarcity might follow. These adaptations are now expressed in an environment of unlimited sweetness and unlimited fat, with no scarcity to follow. The biological responses that served our ancestors so well have become, in changed conditions, drivers of disease. There is also something worth noting about the nature of modern physical activity that goes beyond simple measures of steps per day. The issue is not only that modern people move less, but that the quality and variety of movement has changed in ways that matter biologically. The human body was designed for movement across a wide range of planes and patterns, squatting and climbing, carrying symmetrical loads, changing direction, moving through varied terrain. Modern physical activity, when it happens at all, tends to be constrained to narrow ranges of motion on flat surfaces, the treadmill, the bicycle, the elliptical machine. These activities maintain cardiovascular fitness, but they do not replicate the full spectrum of movement patterns that develop and maintain the human musculoskeletal system in the way that Paleolithic activity did. The result, visible in the posture and joint health of modern populations, is a body that has been used in only a fraction of its designed range. The rise of processed food deserves its own careful attention in this modern contrast, because it represents a kind of dietary impoverishment that is in some ways even more severe than what early agricultural populations experienced. At least medieval peasants ate actual grain, whole wheat bread with its bran and germ intact, vegetables and legumes cooked from their whole form, occasional meat and dairy in relatively unprocessed states. The modern diet, in its most extreme processed forms, consists of food that has been so thoroughly stripped of its nutritional complexity through refining, bleaching, heatus, dehydrating, reformulating, and the addition of artificial flavors and preservatives, that it provides calories and palatability, but very little of the micronutritional richness that the human body requires. The consequences for gut microbiome health, for immune function, for metabolic regulation, for the subtle nutritional sufficiencies that underlie energy, and mood and cognitive function are only beginning to be mapped in detail by nutritional and microbiome science. And yet there is also this, that the knowledge we now have about all of these things, about the Paleolithic diet, and the gut microbiome, and the importance of movement and the biology of sleep, is itself a form of Paleolithic awareness in a sense. The curiosity that drives researchers to excavate ancient burials and measure ancient bones, and analyze ancient dental calculus, is the same curious intelligence that drove Paleolithic humans to explore new landscapes and learn the properties of unfamiliar plants. We have not lost the capacity to learn and to adapt. We have only temporarily found ourselves in a world that changed faster than we could follow, and we are slowly and collectively beginning to find our way back to something more aligned with what we are. This is not a simple task, but it is a meaningful one, and it does not need to be solved tonight. There is something genuinely moving about what the archaeological record reveals if you sit with it quietly for long enough. Here are the bones of people who lived and moved and ate and died before recorded history, before writing, before cities, before kings and priests and all the apparatus of what we call civilization. And those bones, measured carefully by patient researchers, tell us something that no document from those times could tell us, something that no text preserves. They tell us what it felt like to inhabit a body that was fully met by its world. The Paleolithic hunter-gatherer, whose femur shows the cross-sectional geometry of a long-distance runner, whose teeth are intact and uncrowded, whose jaw is broad and well-developed, whose bones are dense and whose muscle attachments suggest a powerful, active physique. That person never knew they were healthy. Health was not a concept in their world. You moved, you ate, you slept. You were part of a group that moved through a landscape together. The body simply functioned, as a well-made thing functions when it is used as it was intended to be used. This is worth dwelling on. We live in an age saturated with health information, with advice and studies and recommendations and products and practices, all aimed at helping the body achieve something called wellness. And much of this information is genuinely valuable. But underneath it all is a strange irony that we are working very hard to achieve, through deliberate effort and conscious choice, something that our ancestors achieved simply by living as their nature directed them to live. The medieval peasant, bent over their field in the cold grey morning, eating their coarse bread and their thin pottage, offers a different kind of reflection. Here too is a human being fully embedded in their world, but a world that had changed, that demanded more and provided less, that had traded the roaming freedom of the hunter for the grinding labour of the field. The medieval peasant's body tells a story of adaptation under pressure, of a species finding ways to survive and reproduce in conditions that were not, in a biological sense, ideal, and if managed, humanity managed. The populations of agricultural societies grew enormously, not because individuals were healthier, but because farming could support more people per acre than foraging, even if those people were individually worse off. This is the paradox at the heart of the agricultural revolution, the one that makes it so philosophically interesting that it was simultaneously one of the greatest expansions of human collective power in history and a significant reduction in the average quality of individual human lives, at least in the physical sense. More humans existed. Each human was in many ways less well. There's a lesson in there that goes beyond nutrition or bone density or the history of farming. It is a lesson about the gap between collective progress and individual well-being, about the way that systems can grow in scale and complexity, while the units within them, the people, experience something more ambiguous. The medieval peasant contributed to a civilization of cathedrals and universities and legal codes and philosophical traditions of extraordinary richness, and they did so while being shorter and sicker and more nutritionally depraved than the what-day hunter who had preceded them by 10,000 years. This raises a question that sits quiet at the edge of many modern discussions about technology and progress. What are we optimizing for? Progress, as a concept, is usually measured in collective terms, in the growth of populations, the accumulation of knowledge, the expansion of human capacity and reach and power. But the individual body, living its single life, has its own measure of what constitutes a good outcome, and those two measures do not always point in the same direction. The anthropologist Richard Lee, reflecting on his fieldwork among the Kungsala of the Kalahari in the 1960s, one of the most influential studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer life, described the quality of calm attentiveness he observed in daily camp life with something that sounded like wistfulness. People sat and talked. Children played. Adults went out to gather and returned with food that was prepared and shared communally. There was laughter and argument and storytelling. There was time, an abundance of it, the kind that does not exist when every waking hour is claimed by labour. That quality of time is what the shift to agriculture most fundamentally altered. Not immediately, and not everywhere, and not permanently, but in the long arc of the transition, the adoption of farming meant the adoption of a new relationship with time and labour. Fields had to be prepared, seeds had to be planted, crops had to be tended, watered where possible, protected from pests and weather, harvested before the rains came or the frost set in. Grain had to be threshed and stored and processed. Animals had to be fed and managed. The agricultural calendar was relentless in its demands, and it created, for the first time in human history, a sustained pressure toward constant labour. And here is something worth holding in mind. The agricultural calendar did not only demand more labour in total hours, it demanded a particular kind of labour that was new in human experience, labour organised around the future. The hunter-gatherer worked to meet the needs of today, perhaps tomorrow. The farmer worked in spring for a harvest that would come in autumn. This orientation toward the future, this planting and waiting and planning across seasons, created a new relationship with time that had profound consequences with the human mind and human culture. It made long-term thinking not merely possible but necessary for survival. It created the conditions for the accumulation of stored food, and therefore of surplus, and therefore of the economic specialization and social stratification that would eventually produce cities and states and all the complexity of civilization. But it also created anxiety in ways that the more immediate-oriented hunter-gatherer lifestyle had not. When you depend on a harvest that is months away, you worry about it in ways you cannot when your food comes from the landscape each day. You worry about drought and flood and frost and insects, and the diseases that can sweep through a monoculture crop in days. You build granaries and guard them. You negotiate with powers, human and divine, to protect what you have planted. The weight of the future settles onto the present in a way that changes the texture of daily experience. The body adapts to what it... Medieval peasants developed remarkable endurance, remarkable tolerance for physical hardship and monotonous labour. They built communities of extraordinary depth and richness, with traditions and practices and social bonds forged by shared work and shared suffering. They were not passive victims of history, they were fully human, in all the complex fullness of what that means, but their bodies carried the evidence of what had been asked of them, and it was written in their bones and teeth in ways that we can read today. To understand the full weight of this, it is worth considering what a year in the life of a typical medieval peasant in Northern Europe actually looked like in terms of physical labour. The agricultural year began in earnest in February or March, when the ground softened enough to plough. Ploughing was brutal work, guiding and controlling heavy wooden ploughs, pulled by oxen across heavy sodden soil, walking mile after mile, day after day for weeks. Then came planting, sowing grain by hand across the prepared fields, hauling seed from storage, covering it with harrows drawn across the soil by hand or by animals. Summer brought tending, weeding, tending to livestock, cutting hay for winter, maintaining fences and ditches, and the 100 small tasks of a working farm. Then harvest. Weeks of non-stop work from before sunrise to after dark, cutting grain with sickle or scythe, binding it into sheaves, hauling the sheaves to the threshing floor, threshing out the grain with flails, winnowing the chaff, hauling the grain to storage, then autumn ploughing and sowing for the winter crop. Then winter, with its animal care, its wood cutting, its food processing and equipment repair, and its cold, which in a poorly heated medieval house with no insulation was a constant physical challenge. There was no vacation, there was no sick leave, there was the church's calendar of feast days, holidays in the original sense, holy days, days when labour was suspended in celebration or prayer. And these were genuinely important periods of rest and festivity. But outside the rhythm of those days, the work was essentially continuous, organised by the needs of the land and the livestock and the seasons, not by the preferences of the body doing the work. And the food that sustained this labour was, as we have established, often barely adequate. The caloric math of medieval peasant life was tight. Enough energy usually to perform the necessary work, but not much more. Not enough protein, often, to build and maintain the muscle mass required for the work being done. Not enough micronutrients to support full immune function. Not enough variety to feed the gut microbiome the diversity it was designed to receive. The body was asked to do medieval work on Paleolithic expectations, and it managed. Humans are extraordinarily resilient. But the cost was visible in the shortness of the stature and the wear in the bones and the teeth. What does this mean for us, living now so many centuries further along? What does it tell us about the relationship between civilization and the human body, between complexity and well-being, between what we build and what we become? Perhaps it tells us that the relationship between collective human achievement and individual human well-being is not as straightforward as we might like to believe. That the pyramids were built by people whose bodies show evidence of significant physical suffering. That the great cathedrals of Europe rose from the labour of people who were, by measurable biological standards, less healthy than the wanderers who had lived on the same land 10,000 years before them. That progress, in the aggregate and statistical sense, can coexist with significant and widespread individual cost. And perhaps it tells us something about the need for humility in how we measure human flourishing. A society that produces great art and philosophy and architecture may still be failing many of its members in the most basic biological sense, in the sense of meeting the deep needs of the body for movement and food and rest and connection. These are not peripheral concerns. They are the foundation on which everything else is built. The brain that thinks philosophical thoughts and the hands that carve stone angels are the same body that needs protein and vitamin D and diverse plant foods and 10,000 steps per day and 8 hours of sleep in the dark. They are not separable, and when the body is underfed and overworked and nutritionally impoverished, the quality of what it can produce and the quality of the life it experiences is diminished in ways that no cultural richness can fully compensate for. This is, in its own quiet way, a revolutionary thought, or at least a corrective one. It asks us to hold two things at once: admiration for the extraordinary cultural achievements of agricultural civilizations, and acknowledgement that those achievements were built, in part, on the bodies of people whose own biological needs were not fully met. It asks us to include the peasant's bent spine and stunted growth in our understanding of what civilization has meant and what it has cost. What does this mean for us lying in the dark tonight, in the quiet of a world that has moved so far beyond both the savannah and the medieval field, both might seem like stories from another species entirely? What is the value of knowing all of this? Perhaps it is simply this, that understanding the history of the human body is a way of understanding ourselves with greater compassion and greater precision. When we feel the pull toward movement, the craving for diverse and varied foods, the deep pleasure of social connection, the restorative power of time that is not organized around productivity, here we are feeling something real, something that goes all the way down to the deepest layers of what we are. Those impulses are not weaknesses or distractions or indulgences. They are the voice of a very old body trying to tell us what it needs. And when we feel the costs of the mismatches, the fatigue of sedentary life, the inflammation of poor diet, the loneliness of social isolation, the low-grade dissatisfaction of lives organized primarily around labor and consumption, we are also feeling something real, something the bones of the medieval peasant would recognize if bones could speak, the sense of a body not quite meeting what it was made for. Not broken, not failed, but gently, persistently asking for something different. The Paleolithic world that shaped us is gone. Its landscapes have been transformed, its megafauna largely extinct, its enormous fish runs depleted, and its dense forests cleared. We cannot go back to it, and the romanticisation of it would be its own kind of distortion. Life in the Paleolithic had its share of suffering, its dangers and losses and limits. But we carry that world inside us still, in every cell of every bone, in the wiring of every metabolic pathway, in the social instincts that make us seek connection, and the physical ones that make us feel well when we move. Knowing this is, in a quiet way, a gift. It's a piece of self-knowledge that goes deeper than personality or preference or the stories we tell about ourselves. It is the knowledge that we are old, far older than our memories or our culture or our technology, that we are the temporary vessels of a very ancient experiment, still running, still producing results, still shaped at its core by the requirements of a life that was lived long before anyone was keeping track. And so we come to rest, as all long journeys eventually do, in the quiet of the present moment. The bones of the ancient dead have told their story. The Paleolithic hunter has walked back into the long grass. The medieval peasant has returned to the furrow. The researchers in their laboratories have set down their calipers and gone home for the night. There is a particular quality to the silence that comes after a long story. It is not empty. It is full of everything that has passed through it, all the images and ideas and quiet observations that have moved through the mind while the voice was talking and the hours were passing. The Stone Age camp by the river, the smell of wood smoke, the sound of children, the vast dark forest pressing in from all sides, enormous and alive and known in every season by the people who lived within it. These images do not disappear when the telling is done. They settle somewhere beneath the surface like stones dropped into still water, and go on resonating in ways that may not be consciously noticed. The medieval field in early morning, the frost on the stubble, the grey sky promising rain, the bent back, the sore hands, the bread in the pocket to be eaten standing without a ceremony because there is no time. These images settle too, not as suffering to be mourned, but as the reality of lives lived fully, however hard, lives that were, in their own terms, complete, that carried their own dignity, that produced their own beauty and meaning alongside their hardship. What remains is simply this: a human body, lying in the dark, breathing slowly, carrying within it the accumulated inheritance of 300,000 years of Homo sapiens and millions more before that. A body that has been shaped by ice ages and migrations, by the invention of fire and the taming of wheat, by all the 10,000 years of civilization that have both helped us and, in certain measurable ways, asked something of us that our deepest biology was not quite designed to provide. That body is yours. It is exactly the same body that stood on the African savannah and watched the sun go down over the acacia trees. It is exactly the same body that walked the cold steppes of Ice Age Europe, and knew by smell and sound and long practice where the reindeer herds would be. It is a remarkable thing, this body, with its ancient competencies and its ancient needs, its capacity for strength and endurance, and the quiet resilience of a creature shaped by millions of years of simply surviving. And it is, right now, in the dark, doing exactly what bodies have always done in the dark: letting go, releasing the day's tensions one by one, the way a fist unclenches slowly when effort is no longer needed. The muscle of the face soften, the jaw unclenches, the shoulders drop a fraction. The belly, which has been held just slightly too tight all day, relaxes into breathing. The hands open on the blanket or the pillow are still. The breath moves in, the breath moves out. It has been doing this with extraordinary reliability through all the days and years and nights of your life, and through millions of years of human lives before yours. It does not require your attention or your effort. It simply continues. Tonight it needs what it has always needed: to be warm, to be still, to feel the slow loosening of the day's tensions as sleep moves in from the ages of consciousness like a tide coming in across a flat dark shore. The question of why Stone Age people were taller and healthier than medieval peasants has led us, as such questions always do when you follow them patiently enough, not just to an answer, but to a different way of seeing. We see that health is not simply the absence of disease. It is alignment. It is the meeting of the body's deep needs by the conditions of its life, and those needs are old and patient, and they do not change as fast as the world around them. The hunter-gatherer who ate well and moved freely and slept in the company of people who knew them by name. That person was healthy not because they were lucky or virtuous, but because their world, for all its dangers, was shaped to meet them. The medieval peasant who stooped over the same field year after year, eating the same bread through the same long winter, was less healthy, not because they were weak or less deserving, but because their world, for all its cultural richness, was not quite meeting their biological needs. And we, living now, somewhere in the long continuing story of this ancient species, we have the extraordinary privilege and the peculiar challenge of knowing all of this, and of choosing, within the constraints of the world we actually inhabit, how to live in a way that honours the body we actually have. That is not a simple task, but it is a meaningful one, and it does not need to be solved tonight. Tonight, the only thing that matters is the breath, the warmth of where you are, the slow, familiar drift towards sleep that has been happening in human bodies every night, for as long as there have been human bodies to sleep. The world outside is quiet now. The ancient past has settled back into the earth from which it came, and you, this ancient, remarkable, complicated, resilient creature, can let go of the day and rest. There is nothing more to figure out tonight, nothing more to understand or to carry or to solve. There is only the body breathing quietly in the dark. There is only the night doing what nights have always done, holding the sleeping world gently, patiently until morning comes. Sleep well,